Okay, so as some of you may know, I am not a trade theorist, and actually not even everything that I'm going to be talking about here is about trade per se, but some of it has to do with trade, and therefore I thought it might possibly be relevant for this summer school. The work is with Michael Kramer, who is also not a trade theorist, but we were puzzled by some issues that arise in trade, and that led us to do this paper. So I begin by making the same observation that Elhanan made repeatedly in his talks, which is that income inequality has been going up quite significantly, and that's true pretty much across the board. It's true in rich countries like the United States and Israel. It's true in poor countries such as India and Mexico. And I put China in this category too, because when the current wave of globalization started, China was certainly a poor country. Arguably now it's a middle income country thanks to its stupendous growth, but it's closer to India and Mexico than the US. Now, our concerns here are income inequality within countries, so we're not going to be talking about what goes on between countries. We were actually relying, and here perhaps our observations differ from those of Elhanan. Tony Atkinson, among others, produced data to argue that income inequality across countries has been declining. Now that, that's what you said. Okay, all right, I misunderstood. So, okay, so okay, good. That's exactly, it actually doesn't bear on what I'm going to be saying, but well, it actually does bear on the last model, but we're primarily concerned here with income inequality within countries, which has certainly been increasing. And the question, of course, is why this should be. And for some of this paper, it's the connection between globalization and inequality that I will be concentrating on. But I also want to look at inequality in places where perhaps trade, globalization did not play a primary role. And the United States may be one of those countries because at least until fairly recently, trade simply did not make up a huge fraction of US GDP. It was under 20% until fairly recently. It was around 15% for a lot of the period that we're talking about. By contrast with Mexico, where trade accounts for about 75% of GDP. Now, it's well understood that there should be a connection between a person's wage and her education and skill. And in fact, we see such a connection in the data. However, the changes in the skill distribution are not enough to account, at least directly, for the changes in the wage distribution.
What does it mean, dispersion in the median?
Oh, no, the median of the skill level has risen, and also the dispersion has risen in the US. I mention the median here because, as you will see, it's going to play a role in the analysis. But the dispersion in skills as measured by education or years of training has not increased in the US and in most other rich countries nearly as much as the dispersion in income. In fact, if we hold the function of wage as a function of skill fixed, if we assume that that does not change, then the change in the skill distribution, the increase in dispersion, can account for, at best, about a fifth of the increase in income dispersion we've seen in the 40 years we're talking about.
Obviously, this depends on the scale by which you measure the dispersion in skills, right? Because if you count it by the number of years of education, if you take the square, it will be a different measure. So when you compare the dispersion in income compared to the dispersion in skills,
We're looking at relative changes. The relative change in the dispersion.
yes, but what does it mean if you count it by years of education? Yes, if you take 2 to the power of the years of education, it will be something different, right? So if each time that you learn a fraction of what you learned before,
There are standard ways of measuring skill. If we use the standard ways, then at least according to those standard ways, we only explain.
What is this standard? Is it the number of years of education, the cost of education? What is it?
I'm not the empiricist here. Perhaps Elhanan can give a better.
At the time an empiricist. In a standard means regression, you regress the log wage of only years of schooling.
Only years of schooling.
Or years, sometimes it's years of experience.
And you also add
Yeah.
years of experience.
Yeah.
So years of experience, you often also add square years of experience. But as far as education is concerned, now there are other measures that use sort of measures of human capital, which are a little more complex. But this is the standard way to do it in the midst of the way.
But the thing that I want to note is that the wage schedule, as a function of skill or education, however you measure it, has not remained fixed. And that is the theoretical issue that we want to concentrate on. And question is, why has it not remained fixed? Well, one One possible answer, which again Elhanan discussed briefly earlier today, is the idea of skill bias technical change. Perhaps technology has evolved in such a way as to enhance the marginal product of higher skilled people more than it's enhanced the marginal product of lower skilled people. That would help explain inequality. And I'm not going to dismiss that possibility here, but I want to observe that it involves a level of empirical measurement which complicates matters. We now have to be able, in addition to measuring skills, to measure technological change. And we also need a rather involved theory, a theory which explains why it should be that higher skilled people are helped more by technological change than lower skilled people. So a major motivation for Michael and me was to see if we could devise a simpler theory, a theory which did not invoke technological change at all. In fact, we've stripped things down to the extent that there's no capital at all in our model. It's a model based on, it's a model based on matching. So the idea is that firms are entities which consist of different jobs or tasks that have to be fulfilled, and the work of the firm is to bring together workers, or perhaps workers of different skills, to fill those jobs, and the combination of skills that the firm brings together within the firm will determine how much output the firm ends up producing. And a key ingredient of the model will be that as the skill distribution changes, for example, the dispersion increases or the median increases, the pattern of matching within firms will change. That is, the particular combination of workers who will be selected to be matched within the firm will change. And that change in the matching process will lead to an enhancement of the income dispersion. That's the basic idea. Now, one additional implication of this approach is that in addition to the greater dispersion of income that the model predicts, we will also get a greater degree of segregation of skill within firms. That is, different firms will look more different than they did before. And as far as we know, this prediction is special to our theory, the segregation, the variation of skills within firms changing. The other theories of inequality that we've seen don't seem to give rise to this particular prediction. Very roughly, what we're getting at is the idea that several generations ago, a firm like GM was the typical American firm, where within a single firm, we had significant variation in skill level. There were the engineers who designed the vehicles. There were the assembly line workers who put the cars together. Quite a difference in skill between those two groups. Whereas today, we have at one extreme a firm like Microsoft, where just about everybody is a high-skill software designer or engineer of some sort. And at the other extreme, we have McDonald's.
When you speak about variation of skills, you speak about variation with respect to the classical measure of skills, yes?
Right. Right. Now, I'm not, as I said before, an empiricist. My co-author, however, is, at least to some extent, an empiricist. And so he, together with the people who kindly provided our data, were able to show that the prediction about segregation within firms of skill levels does seem to be borne out, at least in the three countries that we looked at, the US, the UK, and France. So that's our approach in the US. Now, the other sort of issue that we're interested in is the growth of inequality in poor countries like Mexico, where, as I said before, trade is a huge part of the economy, on the order of 3/4. Back in the 1980s, this was even before NAFTA. It was just after Mexico joined GATT. Tariffs were dramatically reduced. Foreign direct investment was dramatically increased, and within 5 years or so, there was quite a sizable increase in inequality. White-collar wages went up, blue-collar wages went down. And globalization was always suspected to have some explanatory power in telling us why we had this increase in inequality. But the question, once again, is what is the mechanism? I note that if we look at the Heckscher-Ohlin model at face value, it seems to be contradicted by what happened in Mexico, because after all, Mexico has a comparative, if we think of the factors of production as being low skill and high skill labor, Mexico, it would appear, has a comparative advantage in low skill labor. So you would expect that going from autarky to free trade would give low skill wages a boost, and at the same time perhaps harm high skill wages. And in fact, many people who were in favor of trade liberalization in Mexico made exactly that argument beforehand. But as I've noted, just the opposite happened. The high skill wages rose, the low skill wages fell. And we're interested in that because we believe that the same kind of matching model that I just discussed in relation to the US, I haven't shown you the details of the model yet, but that's to come. But the same kind of model can be used to understand the higher inequality in Mexico. Yeah.
Well, there is an argument about this episode in 1985. As you said, Mexico also liberalized foreign direct investment.
Right.
And there's an argument with some evidence that this brought about a decoupling of production processes in southern U.S., where they shifted processes that are considered to be low skill intensive by U.S. standards to Mexico across the border. They had the name for it, Mercadoras or something, I can't remember the name. But what happened is that these processes, while by U.S. standards they were low skill intensive, by Mexican standards they were high skill intensive. And this actually increased the relative demand for skilled workers in Mexico. So this foreign direct investment, and there's some evidence for this, but I don't think it's extremely strong.
You don't think?
I don't think that the evidence is strong enough to explain the shift in wages. But this is
Okay.
a process that could raise inequality both in Mexico and
Okay. So once again, just as for the United States, there have been many proposed explanations for the increase in inequality. The same has been true in poorer countries as well, and the mechanism that Elhanan just mentioned is one of them. Ours is certainly does not stand alone, but I do think one distinguishing feature is the one that I already mentioned, which is the stylized fact about segregation within firms. Okay, I want to come back to Mexico later, but let me go to the U.S. First and show you the model. It's about as simple as as one can imagine such a model to be. In fact, there's just a single good, which is produced by competitive firms. So there's no market power in these firms, and so there'll be no market power in the story about inequality. Labor is the only input. There's no capital, and labor comes in 3 skill levels. Later on, I will expand this to 4. The paper itself allows for any number of skill levels, but once again, for presentation purposes, I'm going to simplify things so that the fewest number of skill levels needed is all that we're going to use. And let's let the proportion of workers having skill level Q be P of Q. Now, firms are inherently identical. That is, they have access to the same technology, to the same production process. Each firm has 2 tasks to be fulfilled. One is a managerial task, which is relatively sensitive to the skill level of the individual occupying that job, performing that task. And the other, which I'll call the subordinate task, is less sensitive to skill. Both tasks are sensitive to skill, but one more than the other. And output is given by this formula. So QS is the skill level of the subordinate, QM is the skill level of the manager, and we square the skill level of the manager to make it more sensitive to skill. The particular exponent here isn't important as long as it's greater than 1. So this kind of production function embodies 3 features which are important for what we want to do. The first feature is that workers of different skills are imperfect substitutes for one another. And I'll explain why that's important in a minute. The second is that different tasks are complementary in the sense that if we enhance the skill level of the manager, that's going to increase the marginal product of the subordinate and vice versa. And the third is that these 2 tasks are not equally sensitive to skill. So why are these features going to be important for what we want to do? The first idea is imperfect substitutability of skill. Suppose instead that we had perfect substitutability. That is, you could take 2 workers of skill Q over 2 and replace 1 worker of skill level Q. Suppose you could make that substitution and get exactly the same performance as before. That would be perfect substitutability. But the problem with doing that is that we can no longer pin down what skill levels we expect to see in a firm, because a firm could just as well hire 2 Q over 2 workers as one Q worker. The imperfect substitutability is critical to making predictions about what skills we're going to end up seeing matched with others in equilibrium. We would also fail to get any increase in dispersion because a Q worker is always going to be paid exactly twice as much as a Q over 2 worker. So that's why we want imperfect substitutability. Now, what about complementarity? Well, if we had a production function that took the sum of the outputs of the two jobs, then the skill level that we would choose for the subordinate worker would be independent of the skill level for the manager. And so once again, we wouldn't have any unique prediction about how the two different jobs should be filled, the complementarity between those two jobs. So complementarity is an important aspect of the theory. And then what about the differential sensitivity to skill? Well, suppose that all tasks were equally sensitive to skill. Production function like this. Well, in that case, we would expect complete segregation of skill. That is, it's well known that in a model where the output is the product of skill levels, that in equilibrium we have what's called fully assortative matching. That is, the manager, the skill level of the manager should be the same as the skill level of the subordinates. So if one is high, the other is also high. But then by changing the skill distribution, we're not going to have any change in this assortative matching, which I've argued is a critical ingredient of our theory. So differential sensitivity still gives rise to a degree of assortative matching. That is, if you have a very high quality manager, you don't want to match her with a subordinate whose skill level is too low, because then you're putting this high quality manager to waste. However, we don't want to have fully assortative matching because, after all, the managerial role is more sensitive to skill. So we'll in general want to have people of higher skill in the managerial role than in the subordinate role. And these two forces, assortative matching and differential matching, are opposing forces. In equilibrium, they are going to be exactly balanced. And it's that balance which gives us the qualitative results that we're interested in. Okay, so what are we looking for? Given the distribution of skills in the economy, we're looking for a wage schedule and a matching rule, an equilibrium matching rule. So pi of q and q prime is the fraction of matches in the economy in which the subordinate worker has skill level q and the managerial worker has skill level q prime. And equilibrium will determine these two functions. And because this is a competitive model, there are no externalities. We will expect a competitive equilibrium to be efficient, and in particular, the matching function is going to maximize output. Remember, there's just one good. A firm that matches Q, workers of level Q and Q prime together, gets this profit. It's a constant returns to scale technology. That is, if you double the number of workers, you double output, you double profit. So in equilibrium, firms will earn zero profit. That means that this expression here, which is a firm's profits, firm's profit will be non-positive. And for firms that actually produce, that is, for whom, for whom pi of q and q prime is positive, those firms will satisfy this inequality this inequality will be binding for those firms. So it may help to look at an example. There are two cases that I want to look at, or two examples that I want to look at. The first is where the dispersion of skills is small, and that means that the high skill is not that much higher than the low skill. So it's less than the square root of 2 times L. The square root of 2 comes out of this from the fact that that in the production function we're squaring the manager's skill level. So let's look at an example where the low, middle, and high skill levels are equally represented in the economy. Then I want to show that in equilibrium we will have low workers matched with middle workers, we will have low workers matched with high workers, and we will have middle workers matched with high workers. So all three possibilities will occur in equilibrium. And to see why that's the case, suppose that instead of low workers being matched with middle workers and low workers being matched with high workers, we actually had some low workers who were matched with other low workers. I want to argue that this actually cannot happen in equilibrium when the dispersion of skills is low enough. Well, if it did happen, then we could not have middle workers matched with other middle workers. Why not? Because we would violate this inequality here. This inequality follows from the fact that skill dispersion is low. And it says that if we have a low worker and a middle worker, it is better to match them together than it is for them each to match. If we have two low workers and two middle workers, it's better to match the low worker with the middle worker and the other low worker with the middle worker than to have segregation. That is, to have one firm with only low workers and the other with only middle workers. That's what this inequality says. And this follows just from low dispersion. So if we had some low workers matched with other low workers, that would imply that we can't have any middle workers matched with other middle workers. Otherwise, we would violate this inequality. And similarly, we couldn't have any high workers matched with other high workers. We get the same contradiction. So that means that if that at least some middle workers must be matched with high workers. And this is going to lead to this inequality, because we're assuming that some low workers are matched with other low workers. We're assuming that some middle workers are matched with high workers, but it would be more efficient to rearrange those matches where the low workers are matched with the middle workers and the low workers are matched with the high workers. This inequality, again, follows from low dispersion. And so our assumption that we had some low workers matched with other low workers has led to a contradiction. We get the same contradiction with the middle workers being matched to other middle workers, high workers being matched to other high workers. None of these possibilities can occur in equilibrium. That means that the only thing left is what I've claimed here, that all of the matches are cross skills. Now, I've gone through this at length because this is the typical kind of calculation in a model like this, working out what kinds of matches can and cannot occur in equilibrium. But once we have worked out that it's only the cross skill matches that can occur in equilibrium, we can actually calculate what the equilibrium wages must be from the zero profit equations. We can solve we can solve from these three equations what the wages in equilibrium are. And we see that in this low dispersion equilibrium, an increase in the median skill increases the wages at the low end and decreases wages at the high end. So for low dispersion economies, increasing average skill actually leads to a decrease in inequality. However, just the opposite, as we'll see, is true in a high dispersion economy. And the US, the UK, France are all examples of high dispersion economies where an increase in the median skill is going to lead to a rearrangement in matching, which leads to these inequalities being reversed. So here is the formal statement of that. Suppose that we have a sufficiently dispersed skill distribution, and this is formally what that means. Now high skill has to be sufficiently bigger than the middle skill, and the middle skill has to be sufficiently bigger than the low skill. Now an increase in the median is going to magnify inequality. And again, rather than showing you the argument in full detail, I'll just sketch the argument for an example. Suppose that at the low end and the high ends, we have 1/5 each, and in the middle we have 3/5. Because of the dispersion in skills, we get these two inequalities. Now, the first thing is that with high dispersion, the high-skilled people are just too productive to be matched with the low-skilled people. So we won't get any matches of low and high-skilled people in equilibrium. However, because of these two inequalities, we don't want to have the low-skilled workers on their own, and we don't want to have the high-skilled workers on their own. It's better for them both to match with people in the middle. I've created I've assumed a large supply of people in the middle, sufficient so that even when all of those workers are matched with either low or high-skilled workers, there's some left over. And this is just to pin things down in this example, for purposes of computation. This means that we know exactly what the wage of the middle-skilled workers is going to be. It's going to have to be it's going to be determined by the zero profit equation of a firm that just hires middle skill workers. The firm is going to produce m cubed of outputs, m times m squared, and so each worker is going to get half of that. And that allows us now to calculate the wages of the low-skill workers. When a low-skill worker is matched with a middle-skill manager, the output is Lm squared. We subtract from that the wage that the middle workers that the middle worker earns, and that leaves us with the wage of the low-skill worker, and similarly for the high-skill worker. It's output minus the wage of the middle-skill worker. And now we can use these two functions to see how a change in median income affects inequality. And we see that low-skill wages go down, and high-skill wages go up. So this, we would contend, is a candidate for explaining what has happened in rich countries. Because of the high dispersion of skill cannot explain things by itself. There's not enough dispersion. There has not been enough increase in dispersion to explain the increase in inequality. However, because of the change in the matching process, the change in the skill distribution does induce an additional effect on wages, which pushes us in the direction of increased inequality. So that's the income inequality part of the story. But I said that there was another implication, which is what happens to matching within firms and across firms, segregation. So let's look at an index of relative segregation, the what we could call between firm variation B and within firm variation W. Between firm variation is defined in this equation. Suppose that there's a particular firm with skill levels Q for the subordinate worker and Q prime for the managerial worker. Then the average skill in that firm is just Q plus Q prime over 2. The average for the whole economy we'll call mu. So if we take the average of Q plus Q prime over 2 minus mu squared, that's the variation of this particular firm from the economy-wide mean. If we look at the average variation across the whole economy, we get the skill variation between firms. What is the skill variation within firms? Well, we really only need to look at one of the two skill levels within a firm, say the lower skill level, Q, because the high skill level differs by the same amount from the mean. So Q minus Q plus Q prime over 2 is the variation within that firm. And if we look at the average variation across all firms, then we have a measure of W, skill variation within firms. And what I want to argue is that, again, if the dispersion of skills is big enough, we should expect a further increase in the dispersion of skills to lead to more, to an increase in the segregation index. In other words, a greater emphasis on between firm segregation as opposed to within firm segregation. And here is again an example of the sort of computation involved. For an example where we're varying epsilon, we start from a distribution where we have 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, and we're increasing the weight in the two tails and decreasing the weight in the middle. When we increase epsilon, the between firm variation increases and the within firm variation decreases. And this is actually quite intuitive. Imagine that most of the weight of the distribution is in the middle. Then we can't have very much between firm variation at all because they're all in the middle. But as we put more and more weight in the tails, we have more and more firms whose workers have skills differing significantly from the average worker in the middle of the distribution. And so B goes up and W goes down. And we move from a situation where General Motors is the norm to one where we have the Microsofts and the McDonald's instead. I'm sorry. Let's go back, though, to globalization, because this is meant to be an international trade seminar. So as I said, one way of looking at the puzzle is that we might have expected Mexico with a comparative advantage in low-skilled labor to benefit as far as inequality goes from from more trade because low-skilled labor is its comparative advantage. Low-skilled wages might have been expected to increase. But the way we want to look at globalization in contrast with Heckscher-Ohlin is as an internationalization of the production process itself. So one notable feature of the last 40 years has been the increase in having a truly global labor force. That isn't to say that workers have moved from country to country, but if we think of computers, for example, computers may be designed in one country. They may have their software developed in another country. They may be assembled in still some other part of the world. And this globalization of the production process has, of course, been made possible by the fact that communication costs have been dramatically reduced, and also to some extent transport costs have been reduced. But we would submit that this is that computers are a good example of the sort of production that this period of globalization, by contrast with the one in the late 19th century, early 20th century, has given rise to. Another example might be banking services. It used to be that if you called up your bank, at least in the US, you would get someone at your bank who would tell you what your balance is or what happened in some transaction a week or two ago. Now, if I call my bank, I don't get my bank, I get someone in Delhi. So the banking production function itself has been globalized. So what implications does our matching model have for globalization and inequality? Well, let's imagine that there are two countries, a rich country and a poor country. And the rich country has workers. I'm going to need 4 skill levels now rather than just 3. So the rich country has skill levels A and B. The poor country has skill levels C and D. And let's say they're ranked this way. We could interchange the B and the C. That would be fine. And of course, in reality, both countries have skill levels at all 4 places, but we're going to simplify, again, for the purpose of illustration. We'll continue to use the same production function that I've been discussing. And the thought experiment that I want to do is to look at equilibrium before international production is possible. I'll call that autarky. There's no trade of goods per se because there's only one good. The autarky here refers to the production process. In autarky, you can have workers in the rich country matched with one another and workers in the poor country matched with one another, but you can't have matching across countries. But after globalization, after the barriers come down, then international matching becomes possible. So the main proposition here is that if the workers at the bottom, the D workers, are sufficiently low in skill compared with the others, and this is the inequality we need, then globalization will always increase inequality in the poor country. And why is that? Well, the formal argument is only a couple of slides, but I can actually say it even more briefly, which is that initially, that is in autarky, the C workers are either matched with themselves or they're matched with D workers, or possibly both. But after production becomes globalized, they have additional matching opportunities. They might match with B workers, they might even match with A workers. And so globalization can only improve the C workers' prospects. They have more opportunities than before. Their wages can only go up. Whereas the D workers, because their skills are so low, will not have international matching opportunities. At best, their wages will stay the same, but they might even go down because they used to be matched with C workers. If all of the C workers have left them to be matched with B workers, the D workers don't even have that matching opportunity anymore. They might be forced to match with other D workers, in which case their wages will actually fall. So C worker wages go up, D worker wages go down, at least weekly. Yes?
Excuse me, so for consider the case like Microsoft willing to have their floor cleaned, and so suppose that we have a local worker who gets some really low salary and like really low skills. So does your model predict that instead of hiring this local worker, they will outsource cleaning to some firm?
Well, there are some services which can't be internationalized. So floor sweeping is not really the kind of job I have in mind, because if Microsoft wants its floor cleaned in Seattle, a worker in India is not going to help very much for those purposes. However, you can indirectly get an effect on the Indian workers' wages if Microsoft is making use of Indian engineers, which it can do without those engineers moving to Seattle. Those engineers might previously have been matched with Indian floor sweepers. Now they're not, and so the Indian floor sweepers' wages will fall. Yeah.
Trying to understand this in context of what Element said in the beginning. So here the nature of globalization seems like FDI. So FDI increased in Mexico is same as, some be setting up call centers in Mexico and making use of labor in Mexico. And it also has this flavor where the low-skilled worker in rich countries is the high-skilled worker in poor countries. So B and C are sort of
Mm-hmm.
more substitutable.
Yes, so I think you're right. This might be a formalization of the sort of thing that Elhanan was talking about. Would you agree?
Yeah.
Yeah. In which case, there's not so much difference between these two approaches after all. Does that resolve your question?
I'm still wondering if the channel that we have here is different from the channel that Elhanan was talking about. But I was just thinking how exactly. But maybe it's not. Maybe it's like a micro foundation of
This certainly could be interpreted as a model of FDI, but it's not limited to that interpretation. That is any sort of mechanism by which sea workers in poor countries are enlisted in the global production process would work for our purposes. Other questions? Okay, so I have all the calculations on the slides. I should say that our normal practice, and I assume we're following it, is to post the slides and also the lectures on the website. So you can consult all of this in detail afterwards. And if you want to consult these details for completeness, you're welcome to do so. But I'm not going to go through them now because I think I've talked you through the argument. So I have to emphasize that just because this model implies an increase in inequality in Mexico or in some other poor country doesn't mean that we necessarily want to stop the globalization process, because just as we can show that there's an increase in inequality, we can also show that total wages rise as a result of globalization. And again, that's apparent, or it's almost apparent, that the C workers' wages are certainly going up. The D workers' wages might be falling, but the opportunity of matching with an even higher skilled worker, which is what is happening to the C worker, outweighs the loss to the D worker. So in principle, the D workers could be compensated for their loss. That isn't to say that they're going to be, but they could be. And furthermore, another policy that could be used to try to correct income inequality is to enhance the skill levels of the D workers. That's not going to happen by itself. No private actor in this model has the incentive to raise the D workers' wages. Maybe the D workers themselves do, but they presumably can't afford the education or training necessary to raise the wages. But the government, for example, could introduce a training and education program to raise D workers' skill level sufficiently so that they have international matching opportunities too, in which case we can, at least to some degree, counteract the growing inequality that globalization is bringing. Question?
I'm wondering, like, to what extent are these findings robust, or these predictions robust to the introduction of a third country? So, if I'm the poorer country's government, could I reduce inequality by lobbying that an even poorer country also joins?
So the short answer to your question is that the model is robust to the introduction of more than two countries. That if we increase more than two countries, then the poorest countries for sure will be subject to exactly this kind of effect, because what's driving inequality here is the idea that some workers are getting new opportunities through globalization, but not all workers are getting new opportunities. So if you increase additional countries, as long as they're richer than the country in question, that logic doesn't go away. Now, as you move up the scale from rich to poor, there will come a point where it's no longer the case that this force by itself increases inequality. In the two-country case, I deliberately focused on the poor country, because if we had looked at the rich country, we would have had exactly the opposite effect. The rich country in this version of the model enjoys a decrease in inequality. The C workers are going to match with the B workers. That improves the B workers' opportunities. The A workers may be affected as well, but they're going to be affected less than the B workers. So this model is an explanation for the growth of inequality in poor countries. To understand inequality in rich countries, we have to go back to the model I was using before, which exploits a change in the domestic skill distribution. And the reason I made that separation initially was because rich countries, at least the United States, seem to have been affected less by globalization than by forces going on within the country itself.
I would like to ask you about the role of the international migration here, because I'm thinking about the brain drain discussion in the international migration literature.
Mm-hmm.
So they would just simply say, okay, we just have the brain drain,
Yeah.
which explains why the inequality rises. So does your model just see the migration as some sort of distortion to the matching, or
So in its purest form, this model, after globalization occurs, is completely unconcerned with where workers are. They could move any place in the world, and we would still get the same matching. Now, of course, that's not realistic, because in reality there are barriers to moving. But the pure model doesn't take account once the barriers to international production have come down to where workers are at all. Any other questions or comments or complaints?
I think that
Yeah.
kind of puzzle. What we were talking before with was about the poorest in the world actually saw an improvement after globalization, right? We said that in the past 40 years,
Yeah.
a lot of people got out of the, however you want to
Yeah.
define the
Right.
poorest level, right? So this model actually predicts that the poorest in the world are the worst hit by globalization.
Okay, so that that issue is worth looking into. I think one has to explore how it is that those people who escaped poverty managed to do so. In China, this happened by their moving to the city and having, well, first having the wherewithal to move to the city, but second, getting at least the training, admittedly not very extensive training, but still significant training to be able to work effectively in a factory, say assembling computers. So yes, they may have come from a D-worker family, but they had enough personal drive and ultimately training to escape the fate of a D worker, and they turn themselves into C workers. It has to be said that although this happens by to a very significant fraction of the Chinese workforce, there are still plenty of D workers left in China who, many of whom are really stuck there unless there is some correction taken by some outside entity like the government to give them the opportunity to work in a factory or some other location which will provide them with more than a subsistence living.
Okay.
You know.
Thank you.
Anything else? Okay, well then let's stop here. Thank you.